Hello everyone, this is National Master Alex King from ChessLessons.com. I want to show a game that I played recently. It was actually played on my birthday. I played in a chess tournament on my birthday. I didn't win the chess tournament, but I did win this game. This is from the first round, and I had white. I started with d4, which is my favorite move, of course. And my opponent, who's rated about 1700, so significantly below me, but still a solid player. He played d5, the most common move. And of course, I would love to play my pawn to e4, but it's not possible right now because of his last move, d5. So I play c4 instead, a common move, the Queen's Gambit. And he plays one of the most solid defenses to it, which is c6, known as the Slav defense. So there's some upsides and downsides to playing the Slav defense. One of the upsides is that black's light squared bishop here on c8 is still free to move wherever it wants. One of the downsides is that the knight next to it on b8 can't go to c6 anymore. But it's a very solid defense because if I ever take on d5 with my pawn, he'll be able to take back with his own pawn and maintain a pawn in the center. Okay, so I just developed a piece, knight f3. He does the same thing, knight to f6. And here the main move for me would be to develop my queen's knight to c3. But I played instead the second most common move, which is e3. And the reason that it's more solid is because now my bishop on f1, next to my king, is defending this pawn here on c4. So if he ever takes it, I can take back with my bishop. And I can also develop that bishop quickly in castle. So it's a little bit more solid than developing a queenside piece first. He responds with the same move, e6. Now e6 is not the move that I would play here with black, but it's not a bad move. I also play the Slav defense with black, and in this position, I always play bishop to f5. And then my idea is that after white develops a piece, I'm going to play e6. And the difference is that now my light squared bishop is outside the pawn chain, and this is a potentially bad bishop. It's the same color as my center pawns. And so I want to have it outside of the pawns, otherwise it'll be trapped inside. Or it could become trapped inside. So with the move order that he plays e6 sooner, but he keeps his light squared bishop locked inside the pawn chain. So by doing that, he runs the risk of this light squared bishop becoming an issue later if he never finds a good way to develop it. All right, I played b3. And the reason that I played b3 is that I want to be able to take back on c4 with a pawn if black takes on c4. And I might also want to fianchetto my bishop. My dark squared bishop, I might want to bring it here to b2. So my opponent plays a little bit of an unusual move, bishop to b4 check. I would say that the main move in this position is definitely knight from b to d7. And bishop b4 is a little bit more unusual. The bishop is not really stable here on b4. I can kick it at any time with pawn to a3. Almost at any time. I can't, of course, do that right now. I'm in check. So I have to block the check, which I do. Knight b to d2. And now my opponent plays another kind of funky move, knight to e4. So at this point, I was already starting to kind of get a sense of what his plan was. He's playing bishop b4 check, he's playing knight to e4. I was getting the sense that he was just getting ready to trade off a bunch of pieces. It looks like the knights are getting ready to get traded, and possibly even the dark squared bishops as well. And, you know, it makes sense for him to want to trade off pieces because he's playing a higher rated player, he has the black pieces, he thinks that trading will bring him closer to a draw. But as we're going to see from the game, it's not necessarily going to mean that he has a safe position just because he's traded some pieces. So I just go about my business, developing my pieces. I let him trade, and he trades again. So I foresaw all this happening, and I had decided that I was happy with my position here. And the reason is that my position looks great. Despite pieces being traded, the pieces that are left on the board are looking beautiful in my position. I have 3 pieces developed, my knight, my bishop, my queen. They all look great. Meanwhile, black has, 0 pieces developed. So I have a big lead in development. So I figured I have plenty to be happy about here. So we both castle, and then he develops his knight, knight to d7. So, okay, he develops his knight. If I give him a few more moves, he'll probably develop his bishop too, and then his queen, and then his rooks, and then I won't be ahead in development anymore. So I decided now's the time. I have to try to make something out of my position here before my development advantage disappears. So I played pawn to e4. Now, pawn to e4 does a couple different things. First of all, it opens up my queen here on d2, which can now access the king side more easily. It also puts some pressure on black's center. I'm challenging black on the light squares, which is where he's strong. All of his pawns are on light squares. And also, after he takes, and I take back, my bishop is looking nice and open, looking at the king side, and also the e-file no longer has a white pawn on it, so that might be a good place to put my rooks. And that's exactly what happens. He moves his knight here to f6 to attack my bishop, and I just didn't even move it. I defended it with my rook. So, again, I'm not unhappy about him being able to trade some more pieces, because I'm not focused on what's leaving the board, I'm just focused on what's left on the board. So what's left on the board is, again, I have 3 pieces developed, my queen, my rook, my knight, and he has, again, 0 pieces developed. Not just that, but let's compare the minor pieces here. My only minor piece left is my knight. It's looking beautiful here on f3, controlling the center, being able to access the king side as well, protecting my pawn. His bishop doing nothing. It's just in the way. It's in the way of his rooks, his queen, and it's not doing any sort of job at all. So he develops his queen to c7. I developed my last piece, and I was just strolling around the playing room, looking at other people's games, admiring my beautiful position, and he played c5. Okay, so c5 gets a pawn off of a light square and onto a dark square. So he's kind of clearing some light squares up, and I figured that he wanted to develop his light squared bishop on the long diagonal. So if, for example, I made a couple of slow waiting moves, h3, he's going to clear some more light squares up, and, whoops, I can't move my king there. And then his bishop is going to come to a nice diagonal here. So then his bishop would be developed. I would have to waste a move moving my rook somewhere. And then he's starting to catch up in development here. My advantage would, it looks like it's kind of evaporating at this point. So I don't want to do that. I don't want to give him time to do all that stuff. And furthermore, I have all my pieces developed. I have nothing left that needs to be developed. So it's time to go on the offensive before he has time to develop that bishop. So I swung my rook over here to g4. And now my rook is bearing down on his king side, and in particular the pawn on g7 is pinned. And I may be able to take advantage of that. Now, he had an opportunity to kind of slow down my attack here if he had played a move like pawn to f6. I think that might be one of his better moves in this position. It looks a little ugly, but the pawn is controlling some key squares. It's controlling the e5 square, it's controlling the g5 square, which is where my knight might want to go, or my queen. Also now his queen is laterally defending the pawn on g7. And, I think that white still has a better position here, but it wouldn't be curtains immediately for black. Instead, he played pawn takes pawn. And I could tell that he was just assuming that I would take back, and then he would figure out what to do next. But I did not take back. I played something else. My rook is already looking at his king. My other pieces are very well placed, ready to assist in the attack. I decided that it might be time to start looking for some kind of combination. So the first move, of course, that I looked at was queen to g5, threatening queen to g7, checkmate. But I noticed he could still play f6, hitting my queen, and again, his queen is laterally defending the g7 pawn. So that didn't seem to work. I also considered moving my queen instead to h6 with the same idea of taking on g7. But I still didn't have a good answer to pawn to f6. So I was thinking, okay, in a lot of these lines he wants to play pawn to f6. How could I stop him from playing pawn to f6 and stop him from using his queen to help defend? And then I thought, well, what if my queen were on f6? So if I could somehow drop my queen from where it is to f6, it would stop his f-pawn from moving, and he wouldn't be able to even take me with his g-pawn because his g-pawn is pinned to his king. So I was thinking, how can I get my queen to f6? And then I saw a quick way to do it. But it involved a sacrifice. I thought maybe I could take his pawn on g7 with my rook. And then when he takes back, I could bring my queen in with check and then maneuver it to f6. So it took some calculation here, but I determined that I would be able to do it, and I would get quite a powerful attack here. So let's take a look at what happened. I took his pawn here, check, sacrificing my rook. Now I'm down a whole rook for nothing. I don't even have a pawn for it because he had already taken my d4 pawn. Put him in check, queen to g5. His king has to go back to the corner, and then my queen comes here to f6 check. So once again his king has to move, and now I have blockaded his f-pawn, so it can't come up to f6 or f5, and that means that his queen can't participate in the defense of his king. However, all of that is not enough to make sure that I'm winning, because it looks like all I can do here is just check him back and forth, which would just be a perpetual check, which is enough for a draw. But, you know, anytime you have a perpetual check, you should always look to see whether you have something more, because you at least have a draw. So the risk is low here. And then I saw, well, why don't I just bring in another piece into the attack? I could say bring my knight in, like this, knight to g5, but I don't really have a threat. My knight's not threatening to take anything, I don't have any other threats, so that doesn't look useful. And then I thought, well, what about my rook? I could bring my rook in like this, rook to e4. Now my rook wants to swing over to g4 and put him in check, which would be checkmate. However, black has this sneaky little defense, pawn to e5. Now his bishop on c8 is controlling g4. And I just can't believe that he would be able to use his bishop, which hasn't done anything the entire game and hasn't moved. I didn't want to let that be the one thing that saves him in this game. So then I thought, well, there's one more thing I can do to bring my rook in, and it's rook to e5. So notice that my queen on f6 and my rook on e5 are stopping both of black's pawns, the f-pawn and the e-pawn, from moving, and that's stopping black's queen and bishop from defending his king. So now my threat is to play rook to g5 checkmate. So he stops that by playing h6. Now he really wants me to take that pawn on h6 because then he can move his f-pawn. So if I took his pawn and he moved his f-pawn, now once again his queen can come in and start blocking checks, defending, covering checkmate things. So I don't want to move that queen yet, so I just brought my rook over first. Rook to h5. Now my plan is to just play rook takes h6 on the next move, and then rook to h8 after that, which would be checkmate. It's surprisingly difficult to deal with that threat. He doesn't really have a lot of ways to meet that. For example, if he tries to move his rook, then I still take, and running away with his king doesn't work. This is still checkmate, rook to h8. So he can't do that. He found what I think is the only thing he can do to stop me from playing rook takes h6 right away, which is queen to d8. Now, of course, he would love it if I traded queens, because then I'm just down a rook for nothing with no attack. Definitely not going to checkmate him. And same thing if I take the pawn on h6 with my rook. He'll be able to just trade queens, no problem. He's up 5 points or 4 points. So I pretty much have to run away with my queen. Fortunately, I have this square, h6. Now my queen and my rook are forming a battery. I'm threatening to play queen h7 checkmate. I'm also threatening queen to h8 checkmate. And let's see what black can do to stop those threats. Well, if he plays pawn to f6, giving his king an escape square on f7, I'm still going to checkmate him, queen h7. If he moves his rook, giving his king another square on f8, then I'm still going to checkmate him with queen h8. If he desperately tries to sacrifice his queen like this, I'm still going to checkmate him on h7. There's actually nothing he can do in this position to prevent both queen h7 and queen h8 checkmate, so he resigned here. And we're on move 22, so it's a relatively quick win, but what's even more striking to me is that black still has 0 pieces developed. He got a few pieces out, traded them off, developed his queen briefly, and then had to move it right back to the starting square. Never got his bishop or rooks out at all. And look at my pieces. All of my pieces are developed. In fact, I had another piece that was developed that I sacrificed. So even though he has 4 pieces and I only have 3, my 3 pieces still outnumber his king, because he's got nothing to defend it. So I think the main lessons to be learned from this game are you have to develop your pieces. In this game, black didn't develop his pieces and he got in big trouble. And another important lesson is that when you're ahead in development, you have to attack, because otherwise your opponent will finish development, then you won't have any advantage at all. And the last lesson is that when you're attacking, don't be afraid to sacrifice material sometimes if it opens up your opponent's king's position and helps you checkmate. Because checkmate is the name of the game, and at the end of the game, you don't count up the material, it just matters who gets checkmated first.